Okay, so now you understand the potassium cycle. You understand potassium fertilizers, inorganic and organic. And we also went through means by which you can determine application rates for inorganic fertilizers. And I gave you a roundabout way in terms of how to determine application rates for organic fertilizers. With all of that said, how do we apply potassium fertilizers to soils? So here's some general information. A single application of a fertilizer will work for low potassium soils with adequate CEC, simply because you can fill up the CEC sites quickly with soils that have low potassium and adequate CEC. Right? Single application should do this. When we lime soils, we know, and you learned this already, that we lime soils to raise pH, but we also lime soils so we can kick the acid-generating ions, iron, aluminum, and hydrogen from exchange sites. And when we do that, we increase the availability of potassium in terms of retention on exchange sites. When we apply fertilizers in general for turf, turf requires about a ratio of 1 to 0.75 in terms of nitrogen to K2O. Sometimes you can apply less potassium with higher nitrogen application rates to turf, and the range can be all over the board from a ratio of 1 to 1.75 to a ratio of 1 to 0.5. It really depends on the amount of nitrogen that's present. I'm not expecting you to remember that, but there it is. What I really want to drive home is on the next slide. So how do we apply potassium? If you can think of it, you can apply it in that manner, right? So this figure basically shows you every single way you can apply potassium fertilizer, and they would all be relatively equally effective. You just have to know the potential of damage to a plant when applying the potassium fertilizer. And we're going to talk about that in, I think, the next video. So how do you apply it? Well, the placement is before planting. You can broadcast and not incorporate it. It's not going to volatilize. If it rains, it'll be moved into the soil profile. You can broadcast and incorporate it. You can subsurface band it with, you can dribble it in with a liquid fertilizer. You know, you just dribble it on the soil surface. You can actually knife the liquid fertilizer in if you want. You can subsurface band it. I'm sorry, this says surface banding. I misspoke. So you can surface band it. So you can just dribble the potassium fertilizer on the soil surface. This would be for, say, liquid fertilizer application. I don't think, and I can't see any reason why a producer would apply it like this in, say, with a solid fertilizer, even in no-till. I don't see that happening. With solid or liquid fertilizer, you could subsurface band. So you can knife it in a band before planting. At planting, you can plant your seed and you can put fertilizer next to the seed. You just have to watch out for salt burn. So you're going to apply a pretty low, typically a pretty low rate of inorganic fertilizer, most likely no more than 10 pounds per acre. You can surface band and dribble apply it. So you plant your seed and then you dribble apply the potassium fertilizer next to the seed, or you can subsurface band. That means below and to the side of the seed. Typically, just like with phosphorus fertilizers, 2 inches over and 2 inches down. You would do something like this, band application, like you see in this picture here, or this picture here, this picture here, or this picture here, or this picture here. If you have soil that has a high ability for potassium to move into interlayers and become non-exchangeable. So you want to keep the potassium concentrated. After planting, you can broadcast across the soil surface. You can place it next to the seed, maybe with a liquid fertilizer, or you can knife it in. All right, so the sky is almost the limit with respect to how we place potassium fertilizers. Here's some pictures. Here's somebody obviously broadcasting in the top left-hand corner picture. Here is somebody, this is spraying a liquid potassium fertilizer on some type of plant. I can't tell what it is. And this is, um, sure looks like liquid fertilizer application, and I can't tell what it is. It might be manure, a liquid manure application. And you see this tube here? That might be a tube that comes from, say, a waste lagoon, and it might be pumping that wastewater into this machine, and then the liquid manure is coming out the back. That's my guess. Regardless, this is all surface application and different forms of surface application. Here's some other placements. So this is dribbling on the potassium fertilizer, a liquid fertilizer. All right, in both instances, there's a big boom with nozzles that just simply emit this potassium fertilizer, and it likely and immediately enters the soil surface or below the soil surface. Then you can do all sorts of things. All right, so here's a picture in the top left-hand corner of somebody applying potassium fertilizer along with anhydrous. So there's a tank. Anytime you see a tank like this and somebody's fertilizing a field, it's more than likely it's probably the anhydrous ammonia. And so the implement looks like this. There's a knife or a shank where this enters the soil, and anhydrous is pumped out and it interacts with the soil below the soil surface. And then the dry fertilizer is coming out of this tube, probably just slightly higher in elevation within the soil. I'll leave it at that. You can subsurface band, and you can do this with planting the seed. So here's an implement, and if you got up close and personal with that implement, this blue section here specifically, the seed, this is hard to see, but the seed tube is here, and the seed is planted. Say it comes out right where this red arrow is. The fertilizer tube or the potassium fertilizer actually comes down this tube, and it's emitted here. And these are either offset. If they're in line, the fertilizer is approximately 2 inches below the seed. And if they're offset, it would likely be offset 2 inches to one side or the other of the seed itself. Okay. So application. Let's talk about broadcast application, and then let's talk about band application. So broadcast application, this is generally, it's broadcast as a granular fertilizer. Potassium chloride is most often used. We can do something called top dressing, which is you broadcast across some plant that's already in place, like forages or turf. On sandy textured soils with low CEC, and especially with irrigated perennial crops, you apply potassium fertilizer. You really should be considering, in these instances, splitting the fertilizer application rate, because, and this should make sense to you, that with sandy or coarse textured soils with low CEC, there's no place for that potassium to go, except for, I shouldn't say no place, but there are few places for potassium to be adhered to, i.e. there's little exchange sites. So potassium can be lost due to leaching in these systems. So if you split apply potassium fertilizer, it makes potassium fertilizer use efficiency greater. You can broadcast fluid application on the soil surface. Fluid grade potassium chloride can be dissolved in water. It's something close to 350 grams per liter. And it can be mixed with other fertilizers, which makes it really attractive. So it can be mixed with, for example, urea ammonium nitrate or ammonium polyphosphate. And so there's a lot of potassium that can be mixed in a gallon of water. In fact, 350 grams per liter must equal about almost 3 pounds per gallon. Pretty interesting. If you're going to band apply, When you band apply potassium fertilizers, that increases the efficiency or crop recovery. And this is especially true for clay or high potassium fixing soils, right? So I mentioned this previously in this video, that when you have a soil that can fix quite a bit of potassium, the last thing you want to do is broadcast and have that potassium see all the soil, because potassium will be fixed in the interlayer of these clays. So we band apply to reduce that interaction with soils and let plants, quote, see more of the potassium. Band applying potassium is also useful in no-till soils as a way to get potassium into the soil. And if you're practicing true no-till, then when we say band application, what we mean is most likely band applying potassium as a liquid fertilizer, so it moves directly into the soil and immediately interacts with plant roots, or you band apply a solid fertilizer maybe prior to or with the seed, so the plant will see that to a greater extent. So that ends our discussion on how to manage potassium fertilizers.